September 16, 1989. Clear Lake City, Texas. Inside the fluorescent-lit aisles of Randall's Supermarket number 117. Boris Yeltsin's hands trembled slightly as he stood frozen in aisle 7, staring at what his brain insisted could not be real. The first democratically elected leader of Russia, 58 years old, veteran of decades in the Soviet Communist Party apparatus, stood paralyzed before a wall of breakfast cereal boxes that stretched from floor to ceiling. 37 different brands, each brand with multiple flavors, each flavor in multiple sizes. His interpreter watched nervously as Yeltsin's face cycled through expressions of confusion, then suspicion, then something close to grief. "This is for normal people?" Yeltsin asked quietly in Russian. "Any person can come in here." The store manager nodded enthusiastically, oblivious to the existential crisis unfolding before him. He pointed to a woman in worn jeans casually loading Cheerios and Frosted Flakes into her cart while corralling 2 small children. What Yeltsin didn't know was that this unremarkable suburban grocery store, chosen randomly from a phone book after his official tour schedule had been completed, would accomplish what 44 years of Cold War propaganda had failed to achieve. Within 3 years, the shocked silence of this September afternoon would transform into the roar of tanks in Moscow as Yeltsin stood atop them, defending democratic reforms. Within 5 years, the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist. And decades later, Yeltsin's own interpreter would confirm that this visit, more than any summit or treaty or ideological debate, had shattered the foundation of Yeltsin's belief in the Soviet system. But Yeltsin was not the first Soviet citizen to experience this particular form of cognitive dissonance. He was simply the most powerful. The pattern had repeated itself throughout the 1970s and 1980s with remarkable consistency. A Soviet military officer, KGB agent, scientist, or diplomat would defect to the West. American handlers would begin the debriefing process, and within days, sometimes hours, these handlers would witness the same transformation. The defector would request to visit an ordinary store. They would enter, they would stop, they would accuse their American escorts of staging an elaborate deception. Viktor Belenko, the young MiG-25 pilot who defected in 1976, had laughed when his CIA handlers first took him to a Safeway in Virginia. Actually laughed. "Very impressive," he said through his interpreter. "You must have worked for weeks to prepare this. But I am not stupid. You cannot fool me." He believed the store had been specially stocked for his visit, that the dozens of customers were actors, that the entire operation was designed to make him provide information by showing him a false vision of American abundance. The CIA officers exchanged glances. They had seen this before. "Mr. Belenko," one of them said carefully, "this is a regular grocery store. There are thousands like it. Would you like to visit another one?" Belenko's smile faded. "You are serious?" They drove him to 3 more stores that afternoon. Different chains, different neighborhoods, different clientele. The inventory varied slightly, but the fundamental truth remained consistent. Acres of food, no lines, no ration cards, no empty shelves, no bribes required, no connections needed. Just walk in, select what you want, pay, and leave. By the 4th store, Belenko had stopped talking. He wandered the aisles in silence, occasionally picking up items and examining them as if they were archaeological artifacts from an alien civilization. He spent 20 minutes in the produce section, holding a pineapple and simply staring at it, fresh pineapples in September in Virginia. Available to anyone with $3. What Belenko couldn't have imagined was that his reaction was not unique to him, but represented a systematic failure of Soviet intelligence and propaganda that had persisted for decades. The disconnect between what Soviet citizens had been taught about life under capitalism and the actual conditions they encountered in America was not merely large, it was absolute. It was total. It was a chasm so wide that trained intelligence officers, educated scientists, and high-ranking military personnel literally could not process the evidence before their eyes without first assuming it was fake. The roots of this disbelief stretched back to the founding mythology of the Soviet state itself. From childhood, Soviet citizens had been taught that capitalism was a system of brutal exploitation where the workers starved while oligarchs feasted. American propaganda films shown in Soviet schools depicted breadlines, homeless families, children picking through garbage for food. Teachers explained that unemployment in America meant literal starvation, that medical care was reserved for the wealthy, that ordinary workers lived in desperate poverty. These were not casual lies or minor exaggerations. They formed the cornerstone of Soviet legitimacy. If capitalism produced abundance, if American workers lived well, if the market economy actually functioned, then the entire justification for Soviet communism collapsed. The hardships endured by Soviet citizens, the shortages, the queues, the rationing, the gray monotony of daily life, all of this was supposed to be the price paid for avoiding the allegedly worse fate of capitalist exploitation. The propaganda was reinforced at every level. Soviet newspapers published carefully selected photographs of American poverty. Television news programs featured stories about unemployment and homelessness. Even technical journals contained articles explaining how capitalist inefficiency led to waste and scarcity. The message was constant and totalizing. America was failing. The West was declining. Socialism was the future. And then a Soviet citizen would defect, and within days the entire structure would crumble. Stanislav Lunev, a GUR colonel who defected in 1992, later described his first visit to an American shopping mall as the most disturbing experience of my defection. Not disturbing because it was unpleasant, but disturbing because it meant everything he had believed, everything he had been taught, everything he had based his worldview upon was false. I had spent my entire adult life serving a system built on lies, Lunev said in a 1998 interview. And the most painful part was realizing how obvious the lies should have been. How could I have been so blind? The blindness was not accidental. It was engineered. Soviet citizens had virtually no access to Western consumer goods. Travel outside the Soviet bloc was restricted to a tiny elite, and even they moved under careful supervision. Foreign publications were banned or heavily censored. Western radio broadcasts were jammed. The Iron Curtain was not merely a political boundary. It was an information barrier designed to prevent Soviet citizens from learning what life in the West actually looked like. For the system to work, this ignorance had to be complete. A Soviet citizen who knew the truth about Western abundance might begin to question why Soviet stores had empty shelves. Why did workers queue for hours to buy basic necessities? Why did the command economy, supposedly so efficient and scientific, produce constant shortages of everything from toilet paper to fresh vegetables? The defectors represented a crack in this informational wall. And when they passed through that crack, the cognitive shock was profound. Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB colonel who spied for Britain and defected in 1985, later wrote extensively about his first visits to Western supermarkets during his years as a double agent in London. Even though Gordievsky had been exposed to Western life for years, even though he had consciously rejected Soviet ideology, he still found himself overwhelmed by the sheer abundance. One intellectually understands that capitalism produces more consumer goods, he wrote. But to stand in a store and see 100 types of cheese, to realize that this is normal, that British workers consider this ordinary and unremarkable, this creates a psychological impact that mere intellectual understanding cannot prepare you for. The cheese example was not random. Cheese, like many food items, was a chronic shortage item in the Soviet Union. Moscow stores might have 2 or 3 types available. And usually only sporadically, workers would hear that a shipment had arrived and rush to queue, hoping to buy some before supplies ran out. The concept of walking into a store and having dozens of varieties available at all times, with no queue, no rationing, no special connections required, was simply outside the framework of Soviet experience. And it was not just food. Defectors reported similar shock when encountering clothing stores, electronic shops, bookstores, and hardware stores. The variety was overwhelming. The availability was constant. The prices relative to American wages were remarkably affordable. A Soviet engineer who defected in 1987 spent an entire afternoon in a Radio Shack in Seattle examining the components available to any hobbyist. In the Soviet Union, these same components would have required special permits, connections, and possibly black market purchases. Here they sat on open shelves with price tags. The defectors were not stupid. They were not naive. Many were highly educated, well-traveled within the Soviet bloc, and sophisticated in their understanding of politics and economics. But sophistication could not overcome the systematic deception they had experienced throughout their lives. The propaganda had been too complete, the information control too total. When Viktor Kravchenko defected in 1944, during World War II, when the Soviet Union and United States were still allies, he described visiting American stores and feeling a sensation of unreality. Kravchenko was a Soviet trade official, educated and worldly by Soviet standards. He had seen the privileged stores reserved for party elites in Moscow, stores that ordinary citizens could not enter. He assumed American abundance must work the same way. These stores with their extraordinary inventory must be reserved for the wealthy, for party members, for the elite. "Anyone can shop here?" he asked his American hosts repeatedly. "Any worker? Any common person?" "Yes," they told him. "Any person." Kravchenko did not believe them, so they took him to working-class neighborhoods, to poor areas, to immigrant communities. The stores were there too, sometimes smaller, sometimes with less variety, but the fundamental truth remained. Food was available, goods were available, no ration cards, no queues, no empty shelves. "Then what?" Kravchenko asked. "Have we been building?" This question, in various forms, haunted virtually every Soviet defector who encountered American consumer abundance. They had sacrificed for the revolution. They had endured shortages and hardships. They had been told these sacrifices were necessary, that they were building a better future, that they were avoiding the terrible fate of capitalist exploitation. And now they stood in American supermarkets, watching ordinary workers casually selecting from dozens of varieties of products that did not exist in Soviet stores, and the sacrifices suddenly seemed not heroic but pointless. The psychological impact went beyond mere embarrassment or disillusionment. For many defectors, it triggered a profound identity crisis. Their entire self-concept had been built around being part of a superior system, a more advanced and rational form of social organization. They had looked down on capitalist countries as backward and exploitative. They had pitied American workers as victims of a cruel system. And now reality was inverting these assumptions so completely that their sense of self was fracturing. Soviet propaganda had prepared them for American poverty, but not American abundance. It had prepared them for exploitation, but not for casual prosperity. It had prepared them for evidence that capitalism was failing, but not for evidence that it was succeeding so thoroughly that ordinary workers took its benefits for granted. The defectors' handlers developed an informal protocol for managing this shock. They learned not to take defectors to the fanciest stores or wealthiest neighborhoods. These could be dismissed as unrepresentative. Instead, they would take them to average suburban supermarkets, to working-class shopping districts, to unremarkable strip malls. The mundane nature of these locations made the abundance more devastating, not less. This was not luxury. This was normal. This was what capitalism produced as a baseline. They also learned to let the defectors spend as much time as they needed processing what they were seeing. Rushing them, pushing them to accept the reality, often backfired. The psychological adjustment required time. Some defectors needed hours. Some needed days. Some needed weeks of repeated visits before they could fully internalize what they were witnessing. Arkady Shevchenko, the highest-ranking Soviet diplomat to defect during the Cold War, described visiting American supermarkets in the late 1970s as walking through a museum of Soviet failure. Shevchenko was sophisticated, educated, and had traveled extensively in the West as part of his diplomatic duties. Unlike most Soviet citizens, he had some exposure to Western abundance. But even he found himself unprepared for the reality of how ordinary Americans lived. In Moscow, if you wanted fresh fruit in winter, you needed connections, money, access to special stores, Shevchenko later recalled. Here I watched a checkout clerk making perhaps minimum wage, buying strawberries in February without a second thought. The casual nature of it was what struck me most. She was not celebrating, she was not hoarding, she was just buying strawberries because she wanted strawberries. That such a thing could be normal, unremarkable, routine, this was what Soviet propaganda had never prepared me for. The strawberries example highlighted another dimension of the shock. It was not merely the quantity of goods available, but the quality and variety. Soviet stores, when they had produce it all, offered limited selection and often poor quality. American stores offered not just strawberries but multiple varieties from different regions at different price points. They offered exotic fruits that most Soviet citizens had never seen. They offered fresh vegetables year-round, something impossible under the Soviet system with its inefficient distribution networks and agricultural failures. The defectors struggled to understand how this abundance was possible. Some initially assumed it must come at terrible cost. Someone must be suffering to produce this wealth. But when they looked for the suffering, they could not find it. American workers were not starving. They were not living in desperate poverty. They had cars, televisions, their own homes. Their standard of living was, by Soviet measures, extraordinary. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Yuri Bezmenov, a KGB propagandist who defected in 1970, later described the experience as reality defeating ideology in a way that was psychologically traumatic. Bezmenov had been a true believer in Soviet ideology. He had created propaganda, not just consumed it. He understood the theoretical arguments for why capitalism should produce poverty and exploitation, and then he stood in Canadian supermarkets, watching the theories crumble against the hard facts of abundance, availability, and casual consumer choice. The ideology was elegant, Bezmenov said in a 1984 interview. It made sense on paper, it explained history, it predicted the future, and it was completely, totally, absolutely wrong. The humiliation of realizing you have been a fool, that you have helped spread lies, that you have wasted years believing in fairy tales, this is not easy to bear. The irony was that Soviet leaders understood the propaganda was false. The Politburo members, the high party officials, the KGB leadership, they knew about Western abundance. They had access to intelligence reports. They traveled abroad under carefully controlled conditions. They shopped in special stores stocked with Western goods. But they assumed the truth could be contained, that the lies could be maintained, that Soviet citizens would never learn the reality. The defectors proved otherwise. Each defection was a crack in the information barrier. Each defector who returned, who told their story, who described what they had seen, spread the truth a little further. The Soviet authorities tried to control the damage, to dismiss the defectors as traitors and liars, to claim their descriptions of Western abundance were exaggerated or fabricated. But the truth was persistent. By the 1980s, the lies were becoming harder to maintain. Western radio broadcasts were reaching more Soviet citizens despite jamming efforts. Smuggled magazines and books circulated in underground networks. Soviet citizens who traveled abroad, even to other communist countries, could see that living standards were higher outside the Soviet Union. The comparison was becoming unavoidable. When Boris Yeltsin stood in that Texas supermarket in September 1989, he was experiencing the same shock that had transformed dozens of defectors before him. But Yeltsin was different. He had the power to do something about it. Yeltsin's visit to Randall's was not part of his official itinerary. He was in Houston to visit the Johnson Space Center. But after the formal tour, his American hosts asked if there was anything else he wanted to see. Yeltsin asked to visit an ordinary store, not a showcase, not a special facility, an ordinary place where ordinary Americans shopped. They consulted a phone book and selected Randall's Supermarket in Clear Lake City, a middle-class suburb near the Space Center. It was a standard American supermarket, approximately 45,000 square feet, carrying about 40,000 different products. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary, just a normal grocery store in a normal neighborhood. Yeltsin entered with his delegation of about a dozen Russian officials and journalists. They stopped just inside the entrance, staring. The store manager, Steve Howard, later recalled that the Russians seemed shocked and skeptical. They spread out, examining the aisles individually, picking up products, checking prices, asking questions through interpreters. In the produce section, Yeltsin stared at the fresh vegetables and fruits for several minutes without speaking. Tomatoes, lettuce, peppers, oranges, apples, bananas, grapes, melons, all available simultaneously, all fresh, all reasonably priced. In Moscow in September 1989, most of these items would have been unavailable or accessible only through special channels. In the meat department, Yeltsin examined the selection with increasing agitation. Multiple types of beef, pork, chicken, turkey, fish, all clearly labeled, all openly displayed, all available for immediate purchase. No queuing system, no limit on quantities, no ration cards. The abundance was staggering by Soviet standards. But it was the dairy section that seemed to affect Yeltsin most profoundly. He stood before the refrigerated cases containing dozens of types of milk, cream, yogurt, cheese, butter, each category subdivided into multiple brands and varieties. He turned to his interpreter and said something in Russian. The interpreter translated, "There are 2 types of cheese in Moscow stores when they are available." The store manager, eager to demonstrate American plenty, showed Yeltsin the pudding section. Rows of pudding cups in different flavors, different brands, different sizes. A trivial product, barely worth noticing by American standards. Yeltsin stared at the pudding for a long moment, then excused himself. His press secretary later revealed that Yeltsin had gone to be alone for several minutes. The emotional impact was too much to process in public. When Yeltsin emerged, he continued the tour. But something had changed in his demeanor. The skepticism was gone. The questions stopped. He moved through the remaining aisles in near silence, occasionally nodding or making brief comments to his aides. At the checkout area, Yeltsin watched several transactions. The speed impressed him. The computerized scanners, then relatively new, allowed checkout in minutes, no manual price checking, no abacus calculations, no haggling. The customers seemed relaxed, casual, treating the entire experience as routine and unremarkable. Before leaving, Yeltsin asked the manager a final question through his interpreter. "Can any person shop here, or is this only for party members?" The manager, bewildered by the question, confirmed that anyone could shop at Randall's. No membership required, no special status needed. Any person with money could walk in and buy what they wanted. Yeltsin nodded slowly. On the flight back to Russia, he was reportedly silent and withdrawn. His interpreter, Viktor Sokodrev, later said that Yeltsin barely spoke for hours after leaving the supermarket. When he finally did speak, it was to say, "When the people find out about this, they will want to hang us." What Yeltsin couldn't have known was that he had just experienced the same transformation that had been breaking defectors for decades. The supermarket had accomplished what no amount of diplomatic negotiation or ideological debate could achieve. It had shown him, directly and undeniably, that the system he had served his entire life was built on fundamental falsehoods. The consequences were profound. Leon Aron, Yeltsin's biographer, later wrote that the supermarket visit was a crucial moment in Yeltsin's evolution from communist reformer to democratic revolutionary. In 1991, when hardline communists attempted a coup against Gorbachev's reforms, Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian White House and rallied resistance. Many historians trace the courage for that stand back to the clarity he gained in a Texas supermarket. The deeper irony was that the Soviets had brought this crisis upon themselves through their own propaganda. By lying so completely about Western conditions, by creating such an absolute disconnect between propaganda and reality, they had armed their own opponents with the most powerful weapon imaginable, the truth. Every defector who saw an American supermarket became a living refutation of Soviet ideology. Every comparison between Soviet shortages and American abundance undermined the legitimacy of the entire Soviet project. Soviet economists and planners knew their system was failing to produce consumer abundance. Internal reports from the 1970s and 1980s, later declassified, show that Soviet leadership was aware of the growing gap between Western and Soviet living standards. But they believed they could maintain control through information management. As long as Soviet citizens did not know how much better life was in the West, they would continue to accept Soviet hardships as normal and inevitable. The defectors and eventually Yeltsin proved this calculation wrong. The truth leaked out. The comparisons became unavoidable. And once Soviet citizens understood that the shortages and queues and rationing were not universal conditions of modern life, but specific failures of the Soviet system, the ideological foundation of communism crumbled. Interviews with ordinary Soviet citizens in the late 1980s and early 1990s revealed that many had heard stories about Western abundance, but assumed they were exaggerated or fabricated. When the truth became undeniable through defector testimony, smuggled photographs, and eventually through glasnost-era media reports, the psychological impact was enormous. People who had waited in queues for hours felt betrayed. People who had made do with poor quality goods felt cheated. People who had accepted shortages as unavoidable felt deceived. The supermarket became a symbol of this betrayal. In Russian, a phrase emerged, Yeltsin supermarket, referring to the moment of revelation when comfortable lies gave way to uncomfortable truths. It represented not just economic failure, but a profound moral and ideological collapse. American intelligence agencies had understood the power of this comparison for years. CIA analysts in the 1980s produced reports arguing that the most effective anti-Soviet propaganda was simply accurate information about Western living standards. No exaggeration was needed. No manipulation was required. Just show Soviet citizens what American supermarkets actually looked like, what ordinary American workers could actually afford, how Western consumer economies actually functioned, and the comparison would do the ideological work. The challenge was distribution. How could accurate information reach Soviet citizens through the Iron Curtain's information barriers? Defectors became one channel. Their testimonies, published in Western media and broadcast on Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, reached some Soviet citizens. Smuggled publications reached others. And gradually, persistently, the truth spread. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the supermarket had become a powerful symbol in Russian consciousness. It represented not just material abundance, but freedom of choice, efficiency of distribution, respect for consumer preferences, and the basic dignity of not having to queue for hours to buy necessities. It represented everything the Soviet system had promised but failed to deliver. Viktor Belenko, the MiG pilot who had defected 15 years before Yeltsin's visit, later reflected on his own supermarket experience in a 1998 interview. "I thought I was prepared for American propaganda," he said. "I expected them to show me carefully selected examples of capitalist success. What I was not prepared for was that the success was not selective. It was universal. It was normal. It was so ordinary that Americans did not even notice it. That was the most devastating realization. They took it for granted." This taking for granted was perhaps the deepest cut. Soviet citizens struggled daily with shortages and made elaborate plans to acquire basic necessities. American workers walked into stores, grabbed what they needed, paid, and left, giving the process no more thought than breathing. The casualness was what made the comparison so painful. The Americans were not celebrating their abundance. They were not conscious of their privilege. They simply lived in a system that worked, and they assumed this was normal. The irony was that the Soviet system had been designed theoretically to eliminate exactly the kind of inefficiencies and inequalities that produced shortages. Central planning was supposed to be more rational than market chaos. Scientific management was supposed to produce better results than capitalist competition. The command economy was supposed to ensure that everyone's needs were met. Instead, central planning produced chronic shortages because planners could not process the information necessary to match production to demand. Scientific management failed because managers faced perverse incentives that rewarded meeting production quotas regardless of quality or utility. The command economy ensured that no one's needs were adequately met because the system lacked the feedback mechanisms that markets provided. American supermarkets, with their seemingly chaotic abundance, represented the success of decentralized decision-making, market price signals, competitive distribution networks, and consumer sovereignty. These were not concepts that Soviet ideology could accommodate. To admit that markets worked better than plans was to admit that the entire Soviet project had been based on faulty assumptions. The defectors forced this admission through their testimony. Yeltsin forced it through his position and subsequent actions. And ultimately, the Soviet people forced it through their choices when given the opportunity. When the Soviet Union fell and markets opened, Russians did not mourn the loss of empty state stores. They embraced the new supermarkets, foreign and domestic, that began to fill the retail landscape. Today, Moscow has supermarkets that rival any in the West. The abundance that shocked Yeltsin in 1989 is now available in Russia itself. But the memory of the Soviet era persists. Russians who lived through those years remember the queues, the shortages, the rationing. They remember being told that capitalism produced poverty while experiencing poverty under socialism. They remember the lies, and they remember the moment when the lies became impossible to sustain. For many, that moment came secondhand through stories of defectors and dissidents. For Yeltsin, it came directly, standing in a Texas supermarket, watching ordinary Americans do their shopping without giving it a second thought. That moment of recognition, repeated across thousands of individual experiences, helped bring down an empire. The supermarket victory was bloodless but total. No missiles were fired. No troops advanced. No territory was conquered. The Soviet Union was defeated by fluorescent lights, refrigerated cases, and rows of products that Americans barely noticed. The most powerful weapon in the Cold War arsenal turned out to be the truth about how ordinary people lived under competing systems. What the defectors didn't know, as they stood in those American stores struggling to process what they were seeing, was that they were witnessing the same revelation that would eventually spread to millions. That casual abundance, that taken for granted prosperity, that unremarkable normalcy of American consumer life would prove more subversive than any propaganda, more powerful than any weapon, more devastating to Soviet ideology than any military defeat could have been. The Soviet Union fell for many reasons. Economic stagnation, military overextension, political sclerosis, ethnic tensions, and leadership failures all played their part. But underlying all of these was a fundamental loss of legitimacy that began when Soviet citizens learned the truth about how the other half lived. And that truth was most vividly, undeniably, painfully clear in the simple comparison between Soviet stores and American supermarkets. 45,000 square feet of retail space in suburban Texas accomplished what decades of diplomacy could not. One afternoon of wandering fluorescent-lit aisles did more to change Boris Yeltsin's worldview than thousands of hours of political meetings. The power was not in propaganda or persuasion, but in simple, direct experience of a reality that Soviet ideology insisted could not exist. The defectors understood this power because they had felt it personally. Many spent their remaining years trying to warn others about the dangers of systematic deception, about the perils of building societies on false foundations, about the inevitable moment when reality intrudes and comfortable lies collapse. Their stories, gathered over decades, formed a consistent pattern of disbelief giving way to recognition, of ideology fracturing against fact, of certainty dissolving in the aisles of ordinary stores, selling ordinary products to ordinary people who had no idea they were participating in the downfall of an empire.